The evening air felt slightly cold as people began gathering outside the grand recital hall. Soft golden lights glowed through the tall glass windows, giving the place a warm and welcoming look. Inside, everything was already prepared. The polished stage, the perfectly tuned piano at the center, and rows of neatly arranged seats slowly filling with guests. It was not just any event. This recital was known for bringing together some of the most respected professors, critics, and talented performers. One by one, people walked in with confidence. Some carried themselves with pride, dressed in elegant outfits, chatting in low but assured voices. Others greeted familiar faces, laughing lightly, as if they belonged there. It was the kind of place where everyone seemed to know someone important. Amid all this quiet excitement, a girl stepped in through the side entrance. She didn't draw attention at first. In fact, it was easy to miss her. She wore simple clothes, nothing flashy or eye-catching. Her hair was neatly tied back, and she held a small folder close to her chest as if it mattered more than anything else around her. Her steps were slow, careful, almost hesitant, as though she was unsure if she had entered the right place. She paused just inside the hall, looking around. The room felt bigger than she expected. The high ceiling, the soft echo of voices, the bright stage. It all seemed overwhelming. For a moment, she stood still, watching others. Some performers were confidently warming up their fingers, pressing invisible piano keys in the air. A few were quietly going over their sheet music, but even they looked calm, prepared. She looked down at her own folder. Her fingers tightened slightly around it. She moved toward a corner, choosing a seat far from the center. It was a place where she could observe without being noticed. She sat down, placing her folder carefully on her lap, and took a slow breath. No one approached her. No one greeted her. And for a while she seemed perfectly fine with that. Across the room, a group of professors stood together. Their voices were low but confident, their expressions thoughtful as they discussed the performances they expected to hear. These were people who had spent years studying music, teaching it, shaping it. Their opinions carried weight. One of them glanced toward the seating area. His eyes paused briefly on the quiet girl sitting alone. There was nothing particularly special about her appearance, nothing that suggested she was among the top performers of the night. He leaned slightly toward another professor and said something under his breath. The other followed his gaze, then gave a faint smile. It wasn't a kind smile. Soon, a few more joined the subtle observation. Their attention didn't last long, but it was enough. A quiet assumption had already been made. Back in her corner, the girl remained still. She opened her folder slowly and looked at the sheets inside. The notes were familiar to her, every line, every symbol. She didn't rush through them. Instead, her eyes moved gently across the page, as if she was listening to something only she could hear. Around her, the noise continued. People walked past, some glancing briefly in her direction, most not noticing her at all. A pair of young performers sat a few seats away, whispering to each other. "Have you seen the list?" one of them asked. "Yes," the other replied quietly. "Most of the top names are performing tonight." Their voices lowered even more, but their eyes wandered across the room. "Not everyone looks like they belong here," one of them added with a soft chuckle. The girl didn't react. If she heard them, she gave no sign. She simply turned a page in her folder and adjusted her posture. Time passed slowly. The hall continued to fill until almost every seat was taken. The low hum of conversation created a steady background sound. It was not loud, but it was constant. Then, a staff member stepped onto the stage. The room gradually quieted. A brief welcome was given, polite and formal. The importance of the evening was mentioned, along with the presence of respected guests and the opportunity for performers to showcase their talent. There was applause, warm but controlled. As the first performer was announced, attention shifted fully to the stage. The girl closed her folder. She placed it gently beside her and folded her hands together. Her eyes lifted toward the stage, watching carefully. The first performance began smoothly. The music filled the hall, clear and confident. It was the kind of performance that matched the expectations of the audience. When it ended, there was applause, measured, appreciative. One after another, performers took the stage. Each had their own style, their own way of playing. Some were bold and expressive, others precise and technical. The professors watched closely, occasionally making small notes or exchanging brief comments. In between performances, the atmosphere relaxed slightly, with soft conversations returning. At one point, a professor near the aisle leaned back in his chair and spoke quietly to the person beside him. "Some of these are predictable," he said. "You can tell who has been trained properly." The other nodded. "Yes, it becomes clear within the first few notes." Their conversation paused as another performer began. The girl remained in her seat, still and quiet. She didn't join in any conversation. She didn't look around to see who was watching. Her focus stayed on the stage, as if each performance mattered to her in a personal way. Occasionally, she pressed her fingers lightly against her palm, almost unconsciously, as though practicing something silently. The list of performers moved forward. Names were called. Applause followed. Music filled the space, and then silence returned before the next introduction. The girl glanced once at the program sheet placed on the empty seat beside her. Her eyes scanned the names. Then they stopped. For a brief moment, her breathing changed just slightly. Her name was there, not at the top, not even in the middle, closer to the end. She looked at it for a few seconds longer, then gently placed the sheet back. There was no visible reaction. No smile, no sign of nervousness, just quiet acceptance. Across the room, the same group of professors continued their observations. One of them, flipping through the program, paused at a name he didn't recognize. He frowned slightly. "Who is this?" he asked. Another leaned in to look. "I haven't heard of her," he replied. A third gave a small shrug. "Probably a last-minute addition," he said casually. "We'll see." There was no further discussion. The assumption was already enough. Back in her seat, the girl sat with her hands resting calmly. The noise of the hall seemed distant now, as if it no longer reached her in the same way. Her focus had turned inward. The performances continued, each bringing its own reaction from the audience. But for her, time began to feel different. Slower, heavier, yet strangely steady. She leaned back slightly and closed her eyes for a brief moment. Not to sleep, not to escape, but to remember. A quiet breath in, a quiet breath out. Then she opened her eyes again and looked toward the stage. The evening was still unfolding, and her moment was getting closer. The sound of applause faded gently as another performance came to an end. The performer stood up from the piano, gave a small bow, and walked off the stage with a calm smile. The audience responded with polite appreciation. It was a good performance, clean, practiced, exactly what most people expected from a night like this. As the next name was being prepared, the soft hum of conversation returned to the hall. In different corners of the room, people leaned toward each other, sharing quiet thoughts. Some discussed technique, others compared performers. A few simply spoke about how long the evening might last. The tone was calm, but beneath it, there was a layer of judgment that seemed to follow every performance. The girl remained in her seat, still holding her quiet space in the corner. Her folder rested beside her, untouched for now. Her eyes stayed on the stage, but she could hear the conversations around her more clearly than before. Maybe it was because her turn was getting closer. Maybe it was because the words themselves were becoming harder to ignore. 2 seats behind her, a low voice spoke. "That last one was decent, but nothing special," someone said. "Yeah," another replied. "Good training, but you can tell when someone doesn't have real depth." There was a brief pause, then a soft laugh. "It shows quickly. Some people just don't have it." The girl didn't turn around. Her shoulders stayed relaxed, her posture unchanged. But her fingers moved slightly, pressing against each other in a small, controlled motion. A few rows ahead, the group of professors continued their quiet discussion. One of them flipped through the program again, stopping at certain names, occasionally nodding or making small remarks. "These next few should be interesting," he said. "They've trained under strong mentors," another added. "You can usually hear the difference." Their attention shifted as the next performer took the stage. The music began again, filling the hall with confident notes. This performance was more expressive, more energetic. It drew a stronger reaction from the audience. Some nodded in approval, others leaned forward slightly, more engaged. When it ended, the applause was louder. "Now that," one professor said quietly, "is what we expect." There were murmurs of agreement. The girl watched closely. Her eyes followed every movement, every pause, every change in tempo. It wasn't admiration in the usual sense. It was something deeper, like she was studying not just the music, but the feeling behind it. As the evening continued, the pattern remained the same. Performance, applause, whispers, judgment. Each performer brought something different, but the reactions around the room often felt predictable. Those who played with confidence were praised. Those who showed even a small hesitation were quietly dismissed. And then, slowly, the attention began to shift. Not toward the stage this time, but back toward the audience. A few more people had started to notice the quiet girl sitting alone. It began with a simple glance. Then another. Someone whispered something, and another person followed their gaze. "She hasn't spoken to anyone," a voice said softly. "Is she performing?" someone else asked. "I think so," came the reply. "Her name is on the list." There was a short silence. "That's surprising," the first voice said. The faint chuckle followed. "She doesn't look like it." The words were not loud. They didn't need to be. They carried just enough weight to reach where they were not meant to. The girl heard them. This time it was clear. Her eyes lowered slightly, not in shame, but in quiet thought. For a brief moment, her mind drifted away from the hall. It went somewhere much quieter. A small room, a worn-out piano, faint light coming through a window, the sound of her own playing, not perfect, not polished, but steady. She remembered the long hours spent alone, repeating the same pieces over and over. No audience, no applause, just the quiet rhythm of effort. She remembered the mistakes, the frustration, the moments when her fingers didn't move the way she wanted them to. And yet, she also remembered why she never stopped. Because when the notes came together, even for a second, it felt like something inside her finally had a voice. The memory faded as the sound of applause brought her back to the present. Another performance had ended. The hall returned to its steady rhythm. A staff member walked quietly along the aisle, checking something on a clipboard. As they passed by her row, they paused briefly. "Be ready," they said softly, almost as a reminder. She nodded once. No words, just a small, calm movement. The staff member moved on. Her turn was getting closer now. The program sheet on the empty seat beside her seemed heavier than before, even though nothing had changed. The names above hers had already been called. One by one, they had taken the stage, played their pieces, and returned to their seats. Soon, there would be no more names left before hers. Across the room, the professors were still engaged in their quiet analysis. One of them glanced again at the program. "That unfamiliar name is coming up soon," he said. "Yes," another replied. "Let's see how that goes." There was a slight pause. "I don't expect much," the first added, his tone neutral but firm. No one disagreed. The expectation had already been set. Back in her seat, the girl adjusted her hands in her lap. Her breathing remained steady. She didn't look toward the people who had been speaking about her. She didn't search for reactions or approval. Instead, she focused on something simple. The feeling of her fingers, the quiet rhythm of her breath, the memory of the keys beneath her hands. The next performer was announced. The hall settled once again. Music began, soft at first, then growing stronger. It was a delicate piece, filled with emotion. The audience listened closely, the room almost completely silent except for the sound of the piano. For a moment, everything else faded. No whispers, No judgment. Just music. The girl listened carefully. Her eyes didn't move. Her expression didn't change. But something inside her seemed to align, like pieces falling into place. When the performance ended, the applause came again, warm and respectful. The performer left the stage. And then there was a brief pause, longer than the others. The kind of pause that feels different, even if no one can explain why. The staff member stepped onto the stage once more. They looked down at the list, and then they spoke the next name. Her name. It echoed softly through the hall. For a split second, nothing happened. Then slowly the girl stood up. No rush, no hesitation. Just a calm, steady movement. A few heads turned. Some out of curiosity. Some out of quiet doubt. The professors looked up from their notes. Their attention shifted fully now. This was the moment they had been waiting for, even if they didn't expect much from it. The girl picked up her folder, holding it close again for just a second. Then she placed it back on the seat. She wouldn't need it now. Her steps toward the stage were quiet, almost soundless against the floor. Each step carried the same calm energy she had shown since the beginning. No sign of fear, no sign of pride, just presence. As she reached the stage, the lights felt brighter. The space felt larger. But she didn't stop. She walked to the piano and stood beside it for a brief moment. The audience watched, some with interest, some with doubt, some simply waiting. The room was silent again. Not the kind of silence filled with music, but the kind filled with expectation. She placed her hands gently at her sides. Then, slowly, she sat down at the piano. The bench creaked softly under her weight. She adjusted her position, small and precise movements. Her fingers hovered just above the keys. Not touching yet, just waiting. The hall held its breath. And in that quiet moment, everything that had been said, every glance, every whisper, seemed to gather in the space around her. But she didn't look at the audience. She didn't look at the professors. Her eyes rested on the keys. Still, focused, ready. The moment had finally arrived. She sat there in silence, her hands hovering just above the piano keys. The hall felt heavier than before, as if every breath from the audience had slowed down at the same time. No one spoke now. Even the small whispers had stopped completely. It was the kind of silence that made everything feel sharper, like the world was waiting for a single moment to break it. Her eyes stayed fixed on the keys. For a few seconds, she did not move. It was not hesitation. It was preparation. Inside her mind, the noise of the hall faded slowly. The faces, the judgments, the quiet doubts. They all became distant. What remained was something she had carried with her for a very long time. Memory. Not the kind that hurt, but the kind that shaped her. A smaller room appeared in her thoughts. One that was far away from this grand hall. The walls were plain, the lighting soft and uneven. There was no audience there. No applause waiting at the end. Only a piano that had seen better days and a girl who returned to it again and again. She remembered the first time she touched those keys. Her fingers had been unsure then. The sound she created was uneven, sometimes wrong, sometimes too soft to even notice. But she kept trying. Day after day, she returned to the same place, sitting alone, repeating the same notes until her hands learned to understand them. There was no teacher standing beside her all the time. No one correcting every mistake. Most of what she learned came from listening carefully, watching closely, and trying again when things failed. Sometimes she would stop and just sit in silence after making the same mistake too many times. Not out of anger, but out of quiet frustration that she didn't know how to express. But she never left. Even on days when her fingers felt tired, even on days when nothing sounded right, she stayed. Because something inside her refused to stop. Music was not just something she played. It was something she felt. Back in the present, her fingers moved slightly, almost like they remembered before she did. She took a slow breath. Then, very gently, she placed her first finger on a key. A single note filled the hall. Soft, clear. It did not rush. It simply existed. The audience did not react yet. They were still waiting, still trying to understand what kind of performance this would be. One note was not enough to judge. Then another followed. And another. The pattern began slowly, carefully, like someone building something piece by piece rather than showing everything at once. Her posture remained steady. Her shoulders relaxed. Her eyes stayed focused on the keys, not the crowd. At the edge of the stage, a few professors leaned slightly forward. Not because they were impressed yet, but because something about the beginning felt different from what they expected. It was too calm, too controlled, not nervous, not rushed, just steady. The music continued. Each note connected with the next in a way that felt intentional. There was no unnecessary force, no dramatic display at the beginning. It was as if she was telling the audience to listen before deciding anything. In the first rows, someone shifted in their seat. A quiet breath was taken. Still, no one spoke. Her hands moved with growing confidence but not speed. The rhythm remained balanced, as if she was building something carefully step by step inside the hall itself. For the first time that evening, the room felt different. Not louder, not more excited, but more attentive. Some of the people who had been talking earlier now watched in silence. The casual expressions they had before slowly disappeared. Even those who had shown little interest began to focus more closely. But she did not see any of that. Her world remained on the keys. Inside her mind, something else was unfolding. She remembered nights when she practiced until her hands felt stiff. She remembered moments when she stopped not because she wanted to, but because her fingers refused to move properly anymore. She remembered sitting in silence afterward, unsure if she was improving at all. There were times she questioned herself. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quiet thoughts that came when no one else was around. Was she good enough? Was she wasting her time? Would anyone ever hear what she was trying to create? But every time those thoughts came, she returned to the piano again. Not because she was confident, but because she couldn't leave something unfinished inside her. Back in the hall, the music slowly changed. The earlier softness began to grow deeper. The notes carried more emotion now, not louder, but fuller. There was something behind each movement of her hands, something that could not be seen but could be felt. A few heads turned slightly toward each other, but no one spoke. The professor's expressions began to shift, though they did not say anything yet. One of them narrowed his eyes slightly, as if trying to understand what was happening in front of him. This was not what they had expected. Not at all. But still, it was early. They waited. The music continued to rise and fall gently, like waves that never rushed but never stopped either. It was not a performance trying to impress. It felt more like a story unfolding without words. The girl's expression did not change. Her face remained calm, almost unreadable. But inside, she was no longer in the hall. She was in every moment that brought her here. The long hours, the quiet nights, the small victories no one saw, and the failures she never told anyone about. She had learned to play not for attention, but for expression. Not to prove something to others, but to understand something within herself. And now all of it was coming out through her hands. A slight shift in the melody brought a deeper tone into the room. It was subtle but noticeable. A few audience members leaned forward without realizing it. Something about the sound was pulling them in. Not loudly, not forcefully, just naturally. The professors exchanged brief looks. Still no words. But now there was less certainty in those expressions. More curiosity. The girl's fingers moved more freely now, though still controlled. It was as if she had finally settled into the music fully, no longer thinking about anything else. The hall, the people, the judgment, it all faded further away. Only the piano remained. Only the sound. In her memory, she saw herself again in that small room. But this time the image was different. She was not struggling. She was not confused. She was simply playing. Not perfectly, but honestly. And that honesty was what carried her forward every time she felt stuck. The music in the hall grew richer. Still not loud. Still not fast, but deeper. It began to fill the space in a way that could not be ignored anymore. Even those who had been skeptical now sat still. completely still. No whispers, no movement, only listening. Her hands moved with increasing flow, as if the piano itself had become a part of her thoughts. Each note followed the other without hesitation now. The story inside the music was becoming clearer, though no one could fully define it. It was not just technique. It was feeling. It was memory. It was something personal being shared without a single word. And slowly, without anyone fully realizing it yet, the atmosphere in the hall began to change. Not because the music had reached its peak, but because something inside it had already started to break through expectations. And no one was ready to admit it out loud yet. But they were listening differently now. Completely differently. Her fingers moved across the piano keys with a calm confidence that did not rush to impress anyone. The hall was still quiet, but now the silence felt different. It was no longer filled with doubt or casual attention. It was becoming something heavier, something more focused. Even the smallest sound from the piano seemed to travel further than before, as if the room itself had started listening more carefully. She sat upright, her posture steady, her breathing even. There was no visible tension in her shoulders, no hesitation in her movements. Every note came out clean, controlled, and yet full of something deeper than technique. It was not just music anymore. It was expression. At first, many in the audience had prepared themselves to see a simple performance. Some had already formed opinions before she even touched the keys. That kind of thinking is common in places like this, where reputation often speaks before talent is given a chance. But now, those same people were beginning to feel something unexpected. Started slowly. A few audience members stopped shifting in their seats. Then a few more became still. Even those who had been quietly talking earlier now turned their attention fully toward the stage. The girl's hands moved with a natural flow, as if she was not thinking about each note individually anymore. It felt like the music was already inside her, and she was only allowing it to come out. There was a strange balance in her performance. Soft moments followed by stronger ones, gentle pauses followed by emotional depth. The professors at the front were no longer relaxed. One of them leaned slightly forward, his hands resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the stage. Another had stopped writing notes completely. The paper in front of him remained untouched. For the first time that evening, he was not evaluating. He was listening, but no one spoke. Not yet. On stage, the girl continued. Her expression remained calm, almost unreadable. She did not look toward the audience. She did not search for approval. Her focus stayed entirely on the piano, as if the world beyond it did not exist. Inside her, however, something different was unfolding. She was not just remembering her practice anymore. She was reliving it. The long evenings when the room was quiet except for the sound of repeated notes. The moments when she would stop, not because she wanted to, but because her hands had become too tired to continue. The times she sat in silence afterward, unsure if any of it meant anything. There had been no applause in those moments. No audience. No recognition. Only effort. And that effort had shaped her in ways no one in this hall could see just by looking at her. Back in the present, the music began to rise slightly, not in volume, but in emotion. The notes carried more weight now, more depth. It was as if she was telling a story that had been building for a long time, slowly revealing parts of it one by one. A soft shift in the melody changed the atmosphere in the room again. Some people leaned forward without even realizing it. Others held their breath for a moment longer than usual. It was not dramatic. It was not loud. But it was powerful in a quiet way that was difficult to ignore. The professors exchanged a brief glance. There was still no conversation, but their expressions had changed. The earlier assumptions were no longer visible. What remained was curiosity, and something closer to surprise. One of them slightly adjusted his glasses, as if trying to focus more clearly on what he was hearing. Another tilted his head, listening more deeply now. The performance was no longer something they could dismiss. Not anymore. The girl's fingers continued to move with steady control. There was no unnecessary force in her playing. Nothing felt rushed. Each note seemed placed carefully, yet naturally, like it belonged exactly where it was. The hall, which had once felt large and distant, now felt smaller. Not physically, but emotionally. Everything inside it seemed closer, as if the music had pulled the audience inward. Even those sitting at the back were now still. Completely still. A quiet shift had taken over the entire room. The girl did not react to any of it. She could not see the changing expressions. She could not hear the unspoken reactions. She was inside the music. And inside that space, something very personal was coming alive. She remembered the first time she had truly felt connected to a piece she played. It was not perfect. It was not impressive. But it felt real. That feeling had stayed with her longer than any praise ever could. That was what she was reaching for now. Not perfection, but truth. The melody shifted again. This time slightly deeper, like a quiet emotion rising from within. It was not sudden. It was gradual, like something slowly unfolding after being held back for a long time. In the audience, a few people exchanged subtle looks. Not because they wanted to speak, but because they were unsure of what they were experiencing. It was difficult to explain. Some performances impressed the ears. This one was beginning to reach something else. Something quieter. Something deeper. One of the professors finally lowered his gaze for a brief moment, as if collecting his thoughts. When he looked back up, his expression was different. Less judgmental. More attentive. Another slowly folded his hands, resting them in front of him, completely focused now. No one made a comment. There was no need yet. The girl's performance continued without interruption. Her movements were steady, her rhythm consistent. But now there was a slight emotional intensity growing underneath it. It was not forced. It was not exaggerated. It felt natural, like something that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to come forward. The piano notes filled the hall in waves. Soft moments that lingered, stronger moments that gently faded, and a continuous flow that connected everything together. In the middle rows, someone quietly placed a hand over their mouth, not out of shock, but out of quiet focus. It was as if they were afraid that even a small sound might break the moment. The girl's eyes remained on the keys, her expression unchanged. But inside her, something had softened. Not weakness, but release. Years of silence were now taking shape through sound. Every hour she had spent alone. Every time she had doubted herself but continued anyway. Every moment she had chosen to keep going even when no one was watching. All of it was here, not as memory, but as music. The hall felt different now. The earlier judgments had not disappeared completely, but they were no longer in control of the moment. Something else had taken over. Something that could not be measured easily. Tension. Full, silent attention. Even the air seemed still. The professors now watched without moving. One of them slowly leaned back, his expression thoughtful. Another kept his eyes fixed on the stage without blinking for several seconds. There was no longer any expectation of disappointment. Only curiosity about what would come next. The girl's hands continued their steady movement. The melody began to shift again, preparing for something deeper, something that felt like it was building toward a turning point. But she did not rush it. She allowed it to grow naturally, like she had learned to do in those long hours alone. Patience, control, and trust in the process. The audience remained completely silent. No one spoke. No one moved unnecessarily. The performance had already changed the atmosphere of the room, even if no one had said it out loud yet. And slowly, without any announcement, it became clear that something in this evening had shifted. Not just in the music, but in the way people were listening, and in the way they were beginning to see her. The hall had become completely silent now, but it was not the same silence that had filled it at the beginning of the evening. Earlier, the silence was filled with expectation, doubt, and quiet judgment. Now it was different. It felt heavier, deeper, as if everyone present had forgotten to even breathe properly. The only sound that existed was the piano, and even that no longer felt like just music. It felt like a voice speaking directly into the room. The girl sat at the piano with the same calm posture, but something inside the atmosphere had clearly shifted. Her hands moved with steady control, Yet there was now a stronger emotional current flowing through each note. It was no longer just a performance. It was becoming a journey that everyone in the hall was slowly being pulled into without realizing it. At first, many people had watched her with quiet doubt. Some had even made assumptions before she played a single note. But now, those same people were no longer thinking in the same way. Their expressions had changed. Their attention was no longer casual or critical. It was fully focused, almost unwillingly drawn in. Her fingers pressed the keys with increasing depth, not speed. The music did not rush. It grew naturally, like a story unfolding on its own. Every note seemed to carry something behind it. Something personal, something real. It was not about showing skill anymore. It was about expressing something that could not be said in words. A few rows away, one of the professors leaned slightly forward, his eyes fixed on the stage. The expression on his face had changed completely from earlier. There was no sign of dismissal now. Instead, there was focus, careful attention, as if he was trying to understand something that was unfolding in front of him, something he had not expected at all. Another professor, who had earlier shown little interest, now sat completely still. His hands were folded, but his gaze was sharp. He did not move, not even slightly. It was as if he feared that even a small movement might break the moment. The girl continued playing without looking up. Her eyes remained on the piano keys. But inside her, something was opening. The music was no longer just coming from memory or practice. It was coming from everything she had ever felt but never expressed openly. The quiet moments when she sat alone, the times she questioned herself, the times she continued even when she was tired. All of it was now flowing into the sound filling the hall. She remembered how often she had played in silence, without anyone listening. There were days when she wondered if her efforts meant anything. Days when she felt invisible even to herself. But she had never stopped. Not because she was certain of success, but because stopping felt like abandoning something that was deeply connected to her. Now, sitting in front of a full audience, she was not trying to prove anything. She was simply letting it all speak. The melody shifted gently, becoming richer. Not louder but fuller. It carried emotion in a way that felt natural, not forced. It was the kind of sound that made people listen without realizing they were being pulled in deeper. In the audience, someone lowered their head slightly, as if trying to process what they were hearing. Another person slowly brought their hands together in their lap, completely still now. Even those who had earlier looked uninterested were now watching with full attention. The hall was no longer divided into critics and performers. It had become one shared space of silence and listening. The girl's expression remained steady, but there was something different in her playing now. A kind of openness that had not been there earlier. It was as if she had reached a point where she was no longer holding anything back. The notes flowed smoothly, but with emotional weight behind them. Each one seemed carefully placed, yet deeply felt. There was no unnecessary display, no effort to impress, just honesty in sound. A professor near the front row slowly adjusted his posture. He had been sitting upright before, observing carefully. But now he leaned back slightly, his expression softening. The change was subtle but clear. Whatever expectation he had before had been replaced by something else. Another professor glanced briefly at him, then back at the stage. No words were exchanged, but there was understanding in that silence. The music reached a deeper point. The girl's hands moved with more confidence now, as if she had fully entered the world she was creating through sound. There was no hesitation in her movement. Every note followed the next with natural flow. In her mind, she was no longer in the hall. She was back in the quiet spaces where she had learned to listen to herself. She saw again the long evenings spent practicing alone. She remembered the frustration of not getting things right, and the quiet determination that kept her going anyway. She remembered how music had always been something she turned to when words were not enough. And now all of that was speaking at once. The hall responded without sound. People were no longer shifting in their seats. No one was looking away. Every eye was fixed on the stage, not out of obligation, but out of genuine attention. The performance had become something that could not be ignored. It was not about technical perfection alone anymore. It was about something deeper that was reaching the audience in a quiet but powerful way. A soft emotional shift moved through the melody again. It was subtle, but it carried weight. The kind of moment that makes listeners feel something they cannot immediately explain. One of the professors slowly placed his hand on the edge of the table in front of him, as if grounding himself. His eyes remained on the girl, but his expression had softened further. There was recognition now, not of fame or reputation, but of something more meaningful. The girl continued without pause. Her movements were steady, her focus unbroken. She did not look for approval. She did not look for reaction. She simply played. And in doing so, she filled the hall with something that felt real. The music began to rise slightly, not in volume, but in intensity. Felt like it was moving toward something important. Not an ending yet, but a turning point. The audience could feel it too. There was a collective sense of anticipation now, though no one spoke it out loud. Even those who had earlier doubted her were now completely silent. There was no judgment left in the room, only attention. The girl's fingers moved with quiet strength. Every note seemed to carry both control and emotion at the same time. It was a balance that could not be forced, could only be felt. Her expression remained calm, but inside, she felt something shift. It was not pressure. It was release. For the first time, she was not holding anything back. Not fear, not doubt, not hesitation, just music. The hall responded without sound again. A few people closed their eyes briefly, as if trying to hold onto the moment more deeply. Others simply stared, completely absorbed. Even the professors, who had entered the evening with expectations and standards, were now fully silent. Their earlier confidence in judgment had faded, replaced by careful attention. One of them slowly nodded to himself, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging something he did not expect to find. The performance continued, growing in emotional depth. The melody carried a sense of movement, of progression, of something unfolding toward something larger. But it was still controlled, still precise, still deeply human. The girl's hands never rushed. Her timing remained steady. And yet, the feeling in the hall kept growing stronger. It was not just music anymore. It was presence. It was honesty. It was something that had slowly taken over every corner of the room without needing to announce itself. And as the performance moved forward, it became clear to everyone there that they were not just watching a performance anymore. They were witnessing something that could not be easily forgotten. The hall was completely still now, as if time itself had slowed down to listen more carefully. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the smallest sound felt like it might break something delicate in the air. The girl sat at the piano, her fingers moving with quiet control, but the energy in the room had already changed in a way that could not be undone. The music continued, flowing smoothly, carrying everything she had built from the very beginning of the performance. It was no longer just a piece being played. It felt like something alive, something breathing through sound. Each note carried emotion, and each pause carried meaning. The audience was no longer judging. They were simply listening. Her face remained calm, but there was a softness in her focus now. It was not nervousness. It was something deeper, like she had fully stepped into the space she was meant to be in. The piano was no longer an object in front of her. It felt like part of her own voice. In the audience, the earlier attitudes had completely disappeared. The professors who had once exchanged doubtful looks now sat in silence, their expressions thoughtful and still. One of them had his hands folded tightly, not writing, not speaking, just watching. Another leaned slightly forward, as if trying to hold onto every moment of the sound. Even those who had whispered earlier in the evening were now completely quiet. There was no distraction left in the hall. Every person was connected to the same moment, the same sound, the same emotion unfolding on stage. The girl continued playing without interruption. Her hands moved with steady confidence, but there was also a deep emotional flow in her performance now. It was not just about precision or skill. It was about expression, about something inside her that had been waiting for a long time to be heard. As the melody moved forward, It felt like the story inside the music was reaching its final shape. Not an ending yet, but a moment of clarity. The kind of moment where everything that came before starts to make sense. She remembered the long path that had brought her here, the quiet rooms where she practiced alone, the moments when she doubted herself but still returned to the piano, the times when no one was watching, but she kept going anyway. Those memories were not heavy anymore. They felt like they belonged in the music itself. And now they were all being heard. In the hall, something subtle changed again. A few people leaned back slightly, as if they were trying to take in what they were feeling. Others remained forward, completely focused, almost afraid to miss even a single note. The professors were no longer analyzing. They were listening. There was a difference now. Before, they had been measuring, comparing, judging. Now, they were simply experiencing. One of them slowly exhaled, as if realizing something he had not expected to see. Another kept his eyes fixed on the stage, his expression unreadable, but deeply focused. The girl's performance continued to grow in emotional depth. The music was no longer just rising or falling. It was flowing like it had its own direction, its own purpose. There was a quiet strength in it now, not loud or forceful, but steady and certain. Her fingers moved without hesitation. Every note felt placed with care, but also with feeling. There was a balance between control and emotion that filled the hall in a way that could not be ignored. Inside her, there was no longer fear, no longer doubt, only music, and something like freedom. The hall felt smaller now, not physically, but emotionally. It was as if the sound had brought everyone closer together into the same shared space of listening. No one looked away. No one whispered. Even breathing seemed quieter than before. The girl reached a section of the piece that felt deeper, more reflective. The tone shifted slightly, becoming softer again, but with greater emotional weight. It was not sadness. It was something more complex. Something like reflection, like understanding. A few audience members closed their eyes briefly, as if trying to hold onto the feeling more clearly. The professors exchanged no words now. There was nothing left to say. The performance was speaking for itself. Her hands continued to move steadily across the keys, and each movement felt connected to everything she had played before. There was no break in the flow, no loss of focus. She was fully present, completely in the moment, and the moment was fully hers. As the music continued, it slowly began to shift again. Not toward intensity this time, but toward resolution. A sense that something was coming together. Not an end yet, but a completion of something important. The audience could feel it too. There was a shared understanding forming silently across the hall. No one needed to explain it. It was simply felt. This was not just a performance anymore. It was an experience. The girl's expression remained calm, but her focus was deeply engaged. Her hands moved with a kind of natural flow that made the piano feel like it was responding to her rather than being played by her. Each note carried a sense of honesty. There was nothing artificial in it. Nothing forced. Only truth expressed through sound. In the audience, the earlier assumptions had completely faded. No one was thinking about expectations anymore. No one was comparing her to anyone else. She had already moved beyond that space. And so had they. One of the professors slowly leaned back in his seat, his eyes still fixed on her. There was a quiet realization in his expression. Not spoken, not shared, but present. Something had been misunderstood earlier. Something had been underestimated. The music continued, now moving gently toward its final passage. The tone was softer again, almost like a closing reflection. It carried everything that had come before, gathered into a single flowing moment. The hall remained silent, completely silent. Even the smallest movement felt absent. The girl's fingers slowed slightly, guiding the music with care. Every note now felt intentional, like it was part of something concluding naturally. She was not rushing. She was allowing it to end the way it was meant to. Inside her, there was no rush either. No fear of finishing. Only acceptance. The final part of the music began to form, soft and steady. It was not dramatic. It was calm, peaceful, It felt like something gently settling after a long journey. In the audience, people did not move. They simply listened. Fully. Completely. The last notes were approaching. The girl's hands remained steady, her posture unchanged, her focus complete. And then, slowly, the final note arrived. It was soft, clear, and held just long enough to fill the space before fading into silence. The hall did not react immediately. No one clapped. No one spoke. Because for a few seconds, no one wanted to break what had just happened. The silence that followed was different from the beginning of the evening. It was not empty. It was full. Full of feeling, full of understanding, full of something that had quietly changed everyone in the room. The girl's hands slowly left the keys. She remained seated for a moment, still calm, as if giving space for the silence to settle completely. Then she gently stood up. No rush, no hesitation, just quiet movement. Her eyes lifted slightly toward the audience for the first time. Not searching, not expecting, just present. And then, slowly, the silence broke. Applause began softly at first. A few hands, then more, and more, until the entire hall was filled with sound. Not polite applause, but real applause. Strong, continuous, sincere. The professors were among the first to stand. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The girl stood calmly on stage, her expression still gentle, still humble. She did not smile widely. She did not show surprise. She simply acknowledged the moment with quiet grace. The applause continued. It did not fade quickly. It stayed long enough for everyone to understand what they had just witnessed. And in that moment, something had changed in the room. Not just about her, but about how talent is seen, about how silence is understood, about how brilliance sometimes arrives quietly, without announcement. And then, just as calmly as she had entered the stage, she turned and walked away, leaving behind a hall that would remember that night for a very long time.